Admittedly, the topics for the videos I create on this channel are a bit self-serving. They're all things that I'm curious to learn more about and stuff that gnaws and nags at me for not knowing the full story of a compelling subject. When it comes to American racing engines, the famed Novi V8 of Indy 500 fame is something I knew existed, but I really didn't know how or why it did. I knew that it never won a race, but again, had no idea why. I also knew it was one of the most legendary power plants in the history of American racing, beloved by the masses, cheered by millions, and supposedly an engine so powerful it took the lives of multiple racers. Was any of this true? Was it all mythology from a past that people are looking at with a nostalgic eye, or was it actually true? Was this engine truly a power plant star-crossed by the racing gods, doomed to be the most powerful engine that the Indianapolis Motor Speedway would see for a period of over 20 years, shackled to inferior chassis, tires, and sometimes drivers? There was only one way to find out, and that was to dive all the way in, and this video is the result. We're going to talk about the era the Novi came to exist in, the reason it was made, the men who funded it, designed it, and built it, the engines that influenced its design, and how an army of drivers, a handful of owners, and the collective racing fandom of America seemed to try to will this beast to the winner's circle at the Indy 500 from 1941 to 1965. It was the loudest, meanest, and many times fastest thing that hit the Speedway over 2 decades, and perhaps its grandest failure as well. The research into this topic has been fascinating. It's been countless hours on the internet reading nostalgic newspaper clips, as well as classic issues of Sports Car Graphic, Hot Rod Magazine, Road and Track, as well as researching in books like Miller by Griff Borgeson and The Miller Dynasty by Mark L. Dees, as well as the book Offenhauser by Gordon Elliott White, along with phone calls and emails with racing historians and knowledgeable enthusiasts. That is where the backbone of all the information in this video has come from. I hope you enjoy it, and now it's time to get to it. In order to set the stage for the creation of the Novi, we have to start with the era in which it was made, and to do that, we need to jump back about a decade before the engine was even conceived. By 1929, with about a decade of economic boom in the United States, the Indy 500 had really evolved. It was a race of boutique, one-off, handcrafted race cars. From the tip to the stern, these machines were mechanical masterpieces. They used custom racing engines, the most advanced automotive engineering of the era, and with them came an astronomical price tag. Eddie Rickenbauer, who owned the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, saw a problem with the overall direction the race was heading in. He didn't think it was sustainable. Beyond that, he saw the race starting to run counter to the original mission of the Speedway as being a proving ground for auto companies. Those same auto companies had all but abandoned participation in the 500 because none of their engines or parts or pieces were used in the race cars. Because of these factors, Rickenbauer made an announcement following the 1929 race for a set of new rules to be employed for 1930 and beyond. The maximum displacement of engines would be 366 cubic inches, or 6 liters, which was a massive increase. No superchargers were allowed unless they were used on 2-stroke engines. Engines would only be allowed to have 2 valves per cylinder. No cars could be lighter than 1,750 pounds, and a host of smaller, perhaps less significant changes. All of this was done as an enticement to auto companies to enter stock block-based engines to compete and work on the prestige that could come along with winning the race. Now, the racing intelligentsia named this the, quote, junk formula, because as they saw it, it was an invitation to trade the wonderful craftsmanship of the cars of the day for a bunch of junkyard parts, junkyard engines, and shrinking budgets. Now, as it happened to turn out, these were the correct rules for the time. Now, they weren't necessarily made as a response to the looming economic depression that was on the way. In fact, nobody could have known how deep that would have gone. But they in many ways helped to save the race because it did draw in more people with smaller budgets, and the car companies did start to trickle in. Studebaker was the first to take advantage with a third-place finish in the 1932 race in a car with one of their engines in it driven by Cliff Bergier. And in 1933, they went whole hog. They entered multiple cars and finished the majority of them in the top 10. Believe it or not, a Buick powered entry finished 5th, but the reality of the situation is that dedicated race engines were still continuing to win the event, and almost all of them carried the name Miller. These were the incredible engines designed by the legendary Harry Miller, the most innovative, inventive, and awesome mind the Speedway had ever seen to that point. He was also one of the worst businessmen to make and lose a fortune in racing seemingly multiple times. Miller's mechanical vision was unmatched in his era. From airplane engines to marine engines to auto racing engines of different configurations and displacement, the man could and did do it all. Inline 4s, V12s, engines for race cars, boats, and race anything. But the constant in his life was a kind of vicious cycle of boom and bust in business, of partnering with people who didn't have his best interest in mind, and when the going got rough, made a break for it, usually with a lot of Harry Miller's money. Now, I will do a video specifically on the Miller engines and how they morphed into what we now know as the Offenhauser 4-cylinder, but for this particular video, we're going to stick to the plot of the Novi, and that means we're going to continue to move forward. Harry Miller will get his due, but I'm going to give the Novi its due in this video. Knowing what we know about Miller's lack of business luck and acumen, we have to introduce the next man into this story, and it's a name you're familiar with, but perhaps not for the reasons you're about to find out. His name was Preston Tucker. Now, Harry Miller had gone bankrupt in July of 1933, having to close his shop and liquidate all of his assets. He had effectively seen his life work evaporate in front of his very eyes. He moved from California to Michigan with his family and tried to come up with the next venture in his life. As it turns out, Preston Tucker, a longtime acquaintance and a famous schemer and salesman, wanted to go into business with Miller. In 1934, the Miller-Tucker corporate entity was formed, initially to fulfill a business operation of building 50 armored cars for the Persian government. Almost as soon as that deal was signed, the man financing the building of the armored cars ended his own life, and with it, the plan to build armored cars. Of course, during the Indy 500, Miller would be called to the Speedway and spend his month there working on and tuning the engines that he had built for so many race cars. After the 1934 running of the 500, Tucker and Miller redoubled their efforts and concentrated on a pretty wild idea that Preston Tucker had come up with. If Miller were able to use his incredible talents to design an advanced car, surely a hopped-up Ford flathead V8 would be enough engine to carry a team to victory, right? After all, it had just been a couple of years previous that a hopped-up Studebaker nearly pulled it off, so this was a concept the two men thought to be very viable on paper. Now, incredibly, Tucker had actually worked at the Ford Motor Company for years before this, and he was able to get a meeting with Edsel Ford. He used his famed sales abilities and convinced Edsel that this would be a complete promotional bonanza for the company. They'd build a fleet of cars, dominate the race, and it would serve as proof that the Ford V8 was the world's greatest engine, and it would be undeniable when they knocked off all the fancy highfalutin race motors. Edsel actually sold his father Henry on the idea, and the wheels were set into motion, which was the problem. The wheel was in motion, but that motion was spinning, not moving forward. After the initial agreement made by Edsel and Henry Ford, there was a long delay of a period at Ford where different departments and people navigated who would be involved and what their involvement would be. Tucker had made an incredible assertion to Edsel and Henry, and that would be the fact that Miller and his crew would build 10 cars for the 1935 Indy 500. The official deal wasn't signed until January 10th of 1935. The race, of course, was in May, and these cars needed to be built from scratch. And Tucker also said they could do the whole job for $25,000 total, which was equally insane as the timeline. The money would come from Ford's advertising budget over the course of 1935. The deal was that Miller and Tucker would supply the cars. Ford had to supply 12 engines and miscellaneous parts to help with the project. It wasn't until February that the final details were actually hammered out. And then by March, virtually nothing had been done, and by this time, Ford was sending their own engineering help as well as scads of equipment to the Miller Race Cars factory to actually get this project completed. Miller and his men worked 7 days a week, with their only relent being Saturday evenings, with the idea that they knew they had to be back at work by 10 a.m. Sunday morning. Miller discovered Tucker was siphoning money off the top and had put his wife and kids on the payroll, but Miller was in a position to do nothing about it. Henry Ford was now showing up at the shop to grumble and exert pressure on an effort that he could see was a shambles, and at some level Miller had to know that this whole thing was shaping up to be a disaster. You cannot actually succeed in racing like this with a fleet of cars being built into what amounted to a panic thrash, no matter how talented and deep your engineering staff is. Incredibly, though, the first car arrived at the Speedway on May 12th of 1935, and they were arriving one by one, minus engines, which were being installed at the track itself on Gasoline Alley. Not only that, these were absolutely beautiful cars packed with innovative engineering ideas. The cars were powered by 150 horsepower flathead V8 engines. They had upgraded cylinder heads, multiple carburetors, more radical camshafts, more compression, pretty much all the hot rodding tricks. Now, these cars were also front-wheel drive, and they used an amazing transaxle of Miller's design. They had 2 forward speeds in reverse. The engines were actually mounted backward to the normal orientation, with the clutch facing the front of the car where the transaxle was. The suspension was also very interesting. In fact, Miller was able to patent it. The hand-formed bodies were sculpted in a beautiful fashion. These things sat low, used unequal length A-arms, leaf springs, and all of it covered in aerodynamic sheathing. These cars looked like $1 million, and 8 of them were actually finished before the race, less than 10, but still kind of miraculous, with only 5 of them being actually capable of running in the event. Every one of them was fatally flawed before they even turned a single lap. One of the things that was interesting on the cars was the steering box that Ford insisted be used. It was an epicyclic steering box which was mounted at the front left corner of the engine. A universal joint was mounted to the exhaust manifold to get the proper steering geometry, and as it turns out, these 2 things would be the undoing of this whole program. As the machines began to make a scant few test runs before the race, problems were discovered, and one by one the experienced, well-known drivers all ditched the program to find other rides, leaving Miller and Ford with a driver lineup that consisted of a bunch of rookies as well as those that had been around the Speedway for many years but had accomplished very little. Of the 5 cars entered, 4 qualified to compete at the race, but none were near the front, and the race itself was a nightmare for both Miller and the Ford Motor Company. With no true time to fix any of the flaws, the issues with the steering became their undoing. The mounting of the box at the front of the engine and the heat that it would get in that area would get the boxes so hot that the grease and lubricants inside would basically cook right out of them. This would stiffen the steering box to the point that the drivers needed superhuman strength to manage the cars in motion. Even worse, when the cars would come in for pit stops and the heat had nowhere to go but simply get trapped underneath the hood with the running engine, the steering would lock up absolutely tight, and there was no fix for it. All but Ted Horn's entry were out by lap 70, and on 145 his steering locked up and he was out as well. This was a grand humiliation for all involved. Henry Ford was so angry that he had the constructed cars shipped back to Michigan, where he locked them into a warehouse, where they sat silent and hidden for 2 years, when finally in 1937, through someone's persuasion, he was moved to begin selling them to close friends and acquaintances of the company. A Michigan businessman named Lewis Welch purchased 2, and Lewis Welch had a plan. His business was called the Novi Equipment Company, and it operated in the small town of Novi, Michigan. Lewis Welch was a wealthy man and an industrialist. He at one point held a position of power at the Ford Motor Company before striking out on his own, opening a plant to produce parts for Ford cars, trucks, and, as many reports say, Ford tractors. He had also opened up a large engine rebuilding and service facility on the West Coast with famed racer and mechanical maven Louis Meyer. Between the 2 businesses, he was making a lot of money, and like so many men of this era with a mechanical mind and a very deep set of pockets, he became infatuated with competing at the Indy 500. As a personal friend of Henry Ford, he snapped at the chance to get his hands on a couple of those dormant Miller Fords that had been quietly sold off. Welch was more than just an executive, though. He was his own type of innovator and mechanical mind. He had 16 patents to his name. The vast majority are in automotive nature. Patents for a muffler design, heating registers to be used in cars, interior heating systems for automobiles, an innovative machine tool chuck, a magnetic-style clutch to be used in industrial equipment and tools, heat exchanger designs, an odd wobble plate device with provisions for cooling and intake charge, and most interestingly, an innovation that tied directly to his business with Louis Meyer, a method for repairing cast-iron cylinder blocks for rebuilding. As you can see in these patent drawings, the design is very specific to the Ford flathead-style engine with its valve location right next to the bore in the block. Pretty neat, right? Beyond this, he later owned the Welch Diesel Engine Company, where he filed patents and was a partner in a company called Parking Control, Inc., which was in the parking meter business. Yeah. Okay, Welch's Indy 500 involvement predates his buying of the Miller Fords in 1937. He fielded cars in the 1934 and 1935 timeframe. In 1935, Herb Artinger failed to qualify in his car, and the second machine he fielded broke before it even had the chance to try and make the race. There's no real record of his participation in 1936, but in 1937 he arrived with his Miller Ford minus Ford power. Instead, Welch had the cars repowered with Offie engines, and with that Miller chassis and the better engine, Herb Artinger qualified third, and along with relief driver Jimmy Snyder, managed a 22nd place finish after suffering a connecting rod failure in the four-cylinder Offie engine on lap 106. In 1938, Artinger was once again the lead driver for Welch, running a 255 cubic inch Offenhauser in the front-wheel drive Miller Ford. He qualified the car 14th, and with relief drivers Russ Snowberger and Cliff Bergier, managed a sixth-place finish, finishing a lap down to winner Floyd Roberts. 1939 was a year of even more excitement as Cliff Bergier qualified 10th at 124 miles per hour and raced to a third-place finish with an average speed of 113.698 miles per hour. This and something else got Welch and Meyer thinking. For 1938, the so-called junk formula had been thrown out, and the race had now moved to align its rules with the Grand Prix cars of the time. Now, this was in hopes to draw some international competition. All of a sudden, cars could carry a 4.5-liter naturally aspirated engine or a supercharged engine of 183 cubic inches or 3 liters displacement. After the 1939 contest, Welch decided that he wanted a fresh, clean sheet engine to power his cars, and the design he wanted was a 183 cubic inch supercharged V8. But these things took time, and this was the era when things were hand-drawn and hand-hewn from raw materials, so there was no way to rush it into production. As such, at the 1940 Indy 500, Welch fielded his Offie-powered car again, this time with Ralph Hepburn driving. Qualifying 21st, the car's steering locked up on the 47th lap, and Hepburn carted a disappointing 29th place finish. It would be the last time Welch's cars had anything less than 8 cylinders. So the natural question is, what were the roots of Welch's new design? In order to discover that, we have to take a quick trip back to 1938 to set the mechanical foundation for the Novi engine. With the new rules for 1938 in place, Louis Meyer, Welch's business partner in the California engine plant, had his own idea of the ideal power plant. Working with legendary Leo Goosen and Fred Offenhauser, he conceived of a 183 cubic inch centrifugally supercharged straight 8. Bud and Ed Winfield are also part of the crew that had varying levels of influence on this engine. While it may appear on its face to be simply 2 Offie engines and a common crankcase, there are many subtle differences, and few parts other than very small stuff actually translate between the two engines. Interestingly, this would be the last new straight 8 engine, racing or otherwise, developed in the United States. Now remember, the famed Buick straight 8 that was made until 1953 had debuted all the way back in 1931, some 7 years before this version. The engine had many innovative tweaks. Scaling up the Miller 122 design, a new approach to both the timing gears as well as driving the supercharger was employed. Now, supercharged Miller engines were known for breaking their blower drives frequently, and a fix was needed, something that could both act as a drive and some sort of a torsional shock absorber to spin the charger without snapping. The fix was to equip the engine with hollow camshafts. Now, this was a dual overhead cam design. Now, inside the camshafts were 2 torsion-style shafts driven by the same gears that spun the cams. They both ran to the front of the engine and engaged the step-up gearbox on the back of the supercharger, providing the power to spin it. Believe it or not, it worked flawlessly and far better than the original design. The engine was called the Winfield, and it was in a car known as the Bose Seal Fast Special. It had a bore of 2.968 inches and a stroke of 3.25 inches. The engine used 2 valves per cylinder and a Hemi-style head. This was a cross-flow design, and the valves were at an 84-degree spread. The connecting rods were 6.5 inches long and were mounted to a crank with 2-inch diameter rod journals. The engine used 5 2.2-inch mains. The blower made 25 pounds of boost, and if one had to guess, the thing made somewhere around 300 horsepower. Leo Goosen also designed the chassis of the car for Meyer. Using beam axles and transverse leaf springs to save money, the car was a very unruly handler with all that power. Meyer was only able to average a qualifying speed of about 120, which got him in, but left him deep in the field. Amazingly, he had clawed his way to 4th place before the oil pump quit and cost him his race. In 1939, with an improved intercooled and beefed-up version of the engine, horsepower was increased by nearly 100, but the chassis was still in question. Meyer qualified at north of 130 miles per hour, suffered one spin during the race, which necessitated a tire change, and then late in the contest spun again, this time crashing in horrifying fashion through the rail in the bottom of the track. Amazingly, he walked away and quit driving in that moment, knowing he'd escaped what seemed to be certain doom. Now, incredibly, this is far from the end of the story of this engine. Rex Mays drove a new car with that inline 8 for the 1940 race, taking pole position and finishing second. In 1941, it runner-up again. In 1946, it qualified number 2 and led the first 38 laps before retiring. In 1947, it finished 6th. In 1948, it actually qualified on the pole again. This engine was at the Speedway until about 1953, but never qualified past that 1948 race. But now we've gotten ahead of ourselves. I had to tell you the story of the Winfield-Meyer Bose Straight 8 because it would serve as the basis for the engine that we're all here to learn about, the Novi V8. So we return to 1939. Lewis Welch has the idea in his head for this V8 engine and approaches Bud Winfield, the brother of a man considered the godfather of hot rodding, Ed Winfield. Bud is the younger brother and has an incredible mechanical mind like his older sibling. Bud's long-standing relationship with Fred Offenhauser meant that his factory would be the site of production, and there was but one man who could take the specs given and draw them into a producible engine, and that was, of course, Leo Goosen. Input from the likes of Meyer and Ed Winfield, likely Welch himself, are all part of the process in the early history of this engine. The bottom line is that Goosen would draw the plans and Offenhauser would produce the final running piece. Now, a quick note on Fred Offenhauser. There were 2 of them. The one our story focuses on here is the original Fred Offenhauser, but he had a nephew. His name was also Fred, and the younger Fred worked for the older Fred as a young guy, and then when the original Fred Offenhauser sold his company in 1946, the younger version went his own way and opened the Offenhauser Speed Equipment Company. So understand when you see Offenhauser speed parts like intake manifolds for big block engines and other stuff, that was the younger Fred Offenhauser. His uncle inspired him, employed him, and certainly got him trained and in the engine business, but there are in fact 2 Fred Offenhausers. We're talking about the original one. Now it's time to go back to the story. In order for Leo Goosen to draw the plans Offenhauser was to execute, he was given the bore and stroke specs, the valve angle, the engine's V angle, the size and number of mains, the rod bearing size, valve sizes, and more as a collection of numbers on paper. He was also given a proposed layout of a 10-inch diameter centrifugal supercharger, which he had to figure on the mounting and plumbing of. What Goosen drew was quite unique for its time in American racing. A dual overhead cam V8 with a front gear train to drive the cams, 2 valves per cylinder at an 84-degree angle, remember the Bose engine, measuring 1.5 inches on the intake valve and 1.44 inches on the size of the exhaust valve. Ed Winfield designed and ground the camshafts using flat-tappet valve cups, and Goosen spec'd a gear-driven quill shaft running down the center of the intake manifold to move the supercharger. With a bore of 3.125 inches and a stroke of 2.937 inches, this thing was over square, meaning the bore is larger than the stroke and was capable of revving like crazy, especially for this era. The engine used a pair of cylinder blocks with integral heads bolted to an aluminum crankcase. This in many ways looked like a pair of 122 cubic inch Offie engines bolted to a common crankcase, and they nearly were. 20 3/8-inch studs were used to bolt the cylinder blocks onto the common crankcase rather than through bolts that many engines use that went all the way through the cylinder block down through the crankcase and closed everything up like a sandwich. Oddly, the engine only used 3 main bearings. Now, was this influenced by Welch's connections to Ford and the 3 main bearing flathead V8? It's one of the few quizzical parts of the engine's design. The mains were a large 2.375 inches in diameter, but a huge 2.6 inches across. Now this is why the engine has its kind of weird split 2-and-2 look per side when you look at the cylinder layout. The huge central main caused the cylinders to be pushed outward. Now the main webs were made of bronze and were actually bolted into the crankcase, not cast as was common for the day. The engine used a 180-degree crankshaft made from a billet of 4130 steel. The connecting rods were forged in a tubular design to start with. They were 5.5 inches center to center. They swung on 2.312-inch rod journals on the crankshaft. The original superchargers were 10 inches in diameter. A 16-bladed impeller wheel was made of duraluminum, and the early blowers had a separate 16-blade shallow-pitch inducer wheel, which was later replaced by a more aggressively pitched 8-blade inducer wheel after a certain number of years. Insanely, the superchargers were spun at 5.35 times engine speed. This meant the tip velocities of the impeller were way past the speed of sound, in fact 1.67 Mach. Modern centrifugal superchargers spin to this degree, but back in the 1940s, the straight-bladed impellers were not nearly as efficient as they are today, and this supercharger was likely buffeting very badly with the speeds it was spinning at. The engine and the blower were working, but not nearly as well as it could have at a lower speed. Now, the noise this engine is so famous for basically comes from the supercharger. Centrifugally supercharged engines tend to be very loud in the first place, but when you take one of these things at full song and the supercharger is spinning at such a speed it turns into basically a siren, that's what the noise was coming from. And the blower, it made boost, and it made a shriek that would come to define the Novi for decades to come. An 80 to 90% methanol gasoline blend was fed into the engine through Winfield carburetors, and yes, all of this was forced through an intercooler before going into the cylinders. The engine made its debut to fanfare in the 1941 Indy 500. With 30 psi of boost from the blower, 6-to-1 compression, and a weight of 660 pounds, it was listed as making 450 horsepower. In an era when a strong Offie was making 300, this was an astronomical number. The engine was absolutely bestial and made more power than anything else in the race by a ton. Oh, it was also stuffed into the same front-wheel drive Miller Ford that had run in 1935 with a 150 horsepower flathead. Ralph Hepburn was tasked with driving the car, and immediately it was easy to see that this thing would be a handful. During practice, it was noticed that the car would smoke as it's made its way down the front straight at terrific speed. Brought in for an inspection a couple of times, the realization was finally made that it was actually spinning the tires down the straightaway when at speed at wide-open throttle. No one had seen anything like it before. Hepburn knew the car was capable of blowing off the field, blowing up the tires, and likely blowing up the transaxle. He qualified easily in the 10th spot at a comparatively lazy 120 miles per hour. Believe it or not, and this is true, he ran the race with a block of wood under the gas pedal to save the tires and the transaxle. That transaxle is trying to handle 3 times the power it had been designed for. Hepburn sauntered to a 4th-place finish in the debut of the Novi, and the future appeared to be very, very bright. Little did anyone know that the engine would, over the next 2 decades, finish in the top 5 only 3 other times. It was clear to Welch, and especially Hepburn, that the old Miller Ford chassis needed replacing as it was completely inadequate to handle the power of this engine, so they planned on it. And then a little thing called World War II happened, which stopped the Indy 500 from happening until 1946. But Welch did not forget. When the war was all but wrapped up in August of 1945, Welch wasted no time going to Leo Goosen and asking him to design a new chassis for his all-powerful Novi engine. For reasons known only to Goosen and Welch, they went with front-wheel drive again. It was a mystifying decision to racers, engineers, and Speedway veterans. Welch liked the idea, but unfortunately the laws of physics did not, and nobody could understand why they would do this with such a powerful engine. The car destroyed tires relentlessly. On top of that, Welch insisted on having the front end use a locked axle, which made the whole thing push like a dump truck in the corners and also created a tendency for the thing to want to snap spin entering and exiting corners. Additionally, the guys would seek and find more power with engine tweaks every year, so any semblance of hope in terms of making this whole front-wheel drive thing work got more and more remote as time went on, and the engine made more and more power. They never let the chassis, the tires, the suspension, anything catch up with the power level of the Novi. So how did it all go down? In 1946, with a new Goosen-designed Curtis-built chassis, the car was definitely fast. Ralph Hepburn set the single lap and qualifying record at 134.449 miles per hour. The blower speed was slowed to 5.2 times engine RPM, and during the race, a brake leak and then a sucked valve ended Hepburn's harrowing ride early. In 1947, a second front-wheel drive car was built along with a second engine. Cam timing was altered, more boost and more compression were screwed into the engine. Cliff Bergier was the lead team driver, and Herb Ardinger was the second. Bergier was leading the race, but additional stops for tire and fuel, and then a broken piston sunk him. He then jumped into Ardinger's car and charged to a fourth-place finish. Much to the delight of the crowd, the mighty screaming Novi just blew past other competitors on the straights, and Bergier's fearless style kept it off the walls barely in the turns. Also in 1947, the Novi went to Bonneville. Sponsored by Mobil Oil, wearing a custom-made canopy, and set to make history on the salt, the 1947 Indy Novi Special was driven by Marvin Jenkins, the son of the legendary Ab Jenkins, to a top speed of 179 miles per hour, and in doing so set 5 international speed records for the 5 and 10 kilometer course as well as the 1 mile distance. This was proof positive that the engine had more hair on its chest, even after some years of dormancy, than any other engine dreamed possible at the Speedway. In 1948, the engine bearings were upgraded, the blower was slowed to 4.8 times engine speed, compression was cranked to 9-1, and forged pistons were added. Cliff Bergier quit the team in practice and qualifying after spins. He claimed that the car was undrivable and simply too dangerous to operate. Ralph Hepburn got in and was promptly killed in a crash. The second car, driven by Duke Neyland, made the fastest lap in qualifying, led the race until having to make an extra fuel stop because of the Novi's unquenchable thirst, and still managed to make a third-place finish. In 1949, Duke Neyland took the pole and is leading the race until the car's rear axle failed. This led to one of the most famous flaming wrecks in Indy 500 history. While badly burned, Neyland survived. Rex Mays in the second car runs all the way up to second place and then takes the lead and suffers an engine failure, finishing 25th after qualifying second. In 1950, 2 bad things happened. Bud Winfield was killed in a high-speed passenger car crash, and the team switched from Winfield to Holley carburetors, failing to qualify due to a multitude of fuel delivery and other pre-race issues. Upon the death of Winfield, Gene Marcinac, a Frenchman and a lifelong racing mechanic, formerly Winfield's right-hand man, took control of the tuning and wrenching side of the Novi program and did an exceptional job. He's actually in the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Hall of Fame and is a legend in his own right. 1951 was an interesting year for the Novi engine. Before his death, Bud Winfield had new ideas he wanted to apply to the Novi engine, and so posthumously they were added. A couple of new blocks were cast, and the bore and stroke was altered to 3.19 inches bore and 2.84 inches stroke. A new beam style of connecting rod was used, larger valves were incorporated in the heads, and there are other small changes made. At this time in history, either 4 or 5 Novi engines had been built, counting these freshly cast 1951 examples. After being burned in 1949, Duke Neyland took the Novi, still in a front-wheel drive chassis, to track records in qualifying and a single lap speed record of 137 miles per hour. The 2 Novi started the race, Neyland limping to a non-finishing 10th position. Only 8 cars were actually left running at the end of this 500, and Chet Miller in the second car finished 25th. Tires and ignition issues sunk them both. In 1952, the engines got new crankshafts, the blowers were stepped up, making 37 psi of boost and therefore more horsepower, and we're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 at this point. New KLG spark plugs fixed the problem from the 1951 race, and Chet Miller set new track records for single-lap qualifying with a speed of 139.6 miles per hour. Amazingly, both cars suffered the same malady to end their days very early, which was the shattering of the quill shafts that actually spun the superchargers. Neither Neyland nor Miller were in contention to win. In 1953, more disaster. Upgraded after the 1952 race, the blower shafts are no longer the issue, but other major ones stood in the way of the Novi. Things like the insanely powerful engine, the locked front ends of the race cars, and the hell for leather drivers. Chet Miller was killed in pre-race practice, the second Novi adjacent death, and one that had many asking if the engine was cursed. Duke Nalen, the man that survived the fire, went through 7 sets of tires en route to an 11th place finish, and likely the most exhausted crew in Indy 500 history. A swap to a Bendix carburetor in 1954 was a grand failure, as Nalen was bumped out of the field and did not start the race. It was in 1954 that Hot Rod Magazine finally got a look inside the mysterious, beloved, honkin' fast and screaming loud Novi V8. Their 1954 exploration tells us that while some things had changed since 1941, most of the original bones were still the same. Their story claims that 3 engines were built and present at the Meyer & Welch Los Angeles plant that they saw, and they were also there to see the engines not only in pieces, but also see them run at the dyno located in the facility. They listed the horsepower at 550 using 44 pounds of blower boost. The engines used the same 3.19-inch bore and 2.8-inch stroke that the late Bud Winfield wanted for 1951. The main webs still bolted in. The Ed Winfield ground cams were in use, although phasing and timing were being tested along with other profiles. They also talked about the domed pistons to fit in the large combustion chambers, the dual valve springs to handle high RPM, and the floating wrist pins held in place with piston buttons, which would eventually be replaced by clips. Now, there wasn't much in the way of change from Leo Goossen's 1939/40 design drawings. In 1955, Troy Ruttman blew up a transaxle and failed to qualify. The entire starting field was powered by Offenhauser engines. And this is where we need to take a little bit of a minute and talk about the mystique of the Novi. For the simple fact above, the entire field being Offes meant that the Novi was a natural rooting interest. Beyond its prodigious power, beyond its man-eating reputation, it was different. A departure from the field of cars that had all but fallen into the same line. No wonder the place would go nuts every time it hit the track. Thankfully, Lou Welch recognized this, and he finally made a critical decision to help the Novi, he hoped, achieve success. He went rear-wheel drive. A brand-new Curtis 500F chassis now housed the Novi for 1956. The crankcase had been recast to accept the Meyer-Drake transmission, and Paul Russo was named the driver. The engine was put back on a Holley carb, and Russo, tires hazing out of the corners, qualified 8th in a display that had the grandstands buzzing. The rear-wheel drive layout seemed to help in driver control, but the massive power was still far more than the tires of the day could handle. Russo quickly carved up the field when the race started. He took the lead, and for 10 laps was stretching it, just long enough for the crowd to gain hope in the Novi. And then he exploded a tire, likely from spinning out of the corners, and he crashed, finishing dead last, ending his race on lap 21. In 1957, a second rear-wheel drive Curtis was introduced with Novi power. Paul Russo was back. The engine had its stroke reduced to 2.625 inches, which dropped the displacement to 167.9 cubic inches. This was likely done to reduce torque, perhaps in an effort to control tire spin and power management. Russo sets a record, qualifies number 1 at 144.817 miles an hour. He ended up battling through a wounded engine to finish 4th. The second Novi was piloted by Tony Bettenhausen to a 15th place finish with a bad throttle linkage, but glory was not totally out of the picture in 1957. There was an event later in 57 called the Race of Two Worlds, which I have covered in a podcast format in my Dorkomotive podcast series. You can check that out. Now, that race was designed to pit the best IndyCar teams and drivers against the best Grand Prix teams and drivers from Europe. The event was to be held on the Monza course and the high-speed ring. While most of the Grand Prix teams boycotted, the Americans went there and flew. None were faster than Tony Bettenhausen. Bettenhausen set the world's closed-course speed record with a breathtaking lap of 177.046 miles per hour. This was as death-defying and mind-boggling a feat at the time you can imagine in racing. The lack of safety protections, tire technology, and so much more made this risky business. As if right on cue, both Novi engines failed during the actual race. Neither car finished, but the mighty engine had taken the world's record in dramatic fashion. The 1958 iteration of the Novi had Bosch magnetos from the Mercedes Grand Prix cars and now dual spark plugs per cylinder. It also had the horrid luck it always managed to have. Paul Russo was taken out in a lap 1 wreck, and Bill Cheeseborg managed a 10th place finish. Humdrum stuff. In 1959 and 60, mutual disasters. No Novi-powered cars qualified either year due to more fuel system changes. A failed swap to Hilborn injection, and then a switch back to Bendix carburetors not only sunk the hopes of the team, it pushed Lou Welch past the breaking point. Lou Welch was over the whole thing, and he wanted every nut and bolt gone. Thankfully, there was a willing buyer, and that buyer was looking for the deal of a lifetime. Andy Granatelli, the man of STP, Studebaker, and Paxton Supercharger fame, along with Grand Corps and his other ventures, couldn't say yes fast enough when Welch offered him the cars, the engines, every last nut, bolt, and part for the princely sum of $10,000. Long obsessed with winning the Indy 500, Granatelli was seduced by the power and potential of the Novi, just as millions of racing fans had been since 1941. He'd be the one to succeed. His 1961 purchase and pair of Novi-powered entries would absolutely guarantee it, at least in his own mind. And then at the 1961 race, Ralph Liguori blew up one engine in practice, and the second entry blew up a transmission in qualifying, and neither car qualified. Granatelli went to work hard. One of the biggest personalities of the Indy 500 finally had the engine to match. It was voracious, it was loud, and it was destined for greatness. He vastly improved the supercharger through his Paxton company, lowered the compression ratio to 8-to-1, added magnesium covers and parts wherever he could on the engine, which lowered the weight to 510 pounds. He had 2 new Curtiss chassis built to go along with the 1956 car, and he claimed the engines were making an incredible 754 horsepower at this point on his dyno and testing. At the Speedway with new Bendix fuel injection, neither car could stay running, and neither car qualified. For 1963, Granatelli invested in new blocks. The engine used similar intake and exhaust ports. The blower was slowed to 4.5 times engine speed, and he had 3 strong running cars with 3 strong drivers. Bobby Unser, Jim Hurtubise, and a driver of all trades who had mastered the art of stock cars, had done some open-wheel racing, sprint cars, and of course top fuel dragsters, a man named Art Malone. Hurtubise led the race before being retired on lap 102 with an oil leak. Art Malone in the old 1956 car was charging hard before his clutch blew up on lap 18. And Bobby Unser, young lion that he was in his rookie start, managed to wreck in turn 1 on lap 2. Granatelli managed to create what he dreamed was an Indy super weapon for 1964. After watching the 1963 race, Sterling Moss approached Andy Granatelli with an idea: 4-wheel drive. Moss had seen the incredible power of the Novi and understood that no race car on the planet had the chassis tech and grip to harness the engine. But if the power was going to all 4 corners, that could change the game. Granatelli and Moss went to the Ferguson Company in England and inquired about a race car demonstration. In August of '63, Ferguson sent a car with a tired engine and worn tires to Indianapolis Motor Speedway as a demonstrator. Granatelli, running the stopwatch, was blown away at the speeds that this car was running, and he ordered a chassis on the spot. A guy named Tony Rolt, who was the Ferguson manager and technical director, was charged with getting the chassis done. And as Ferguson was located across the pond, there was a prodigious number of telegrams and correspondence as the whole process was going on. As the car was being built, in 4 months, mind you, Granatelli was saving more weight, getting the Novi engine down to a claimed 470 pounds. The Ferguson chassis was built in a unique style. It was part space frame and semi-monocoque, had a 100-inch wheelbase, a 60-inch track width, and that was the measurement from the outside of the right front tire to the outside of the left front tire. It used 9 3/8-inch wide, 18-inch diameter Dunlop wheels and 11-inch disc brakes. The suspension used unequal length A-arms and a cantilever, shock and spring kind of inboard arrangement. Huge sway bars, rack and pinion steering, and a 4-speed Ferguson transmission handled the power. The torque was split 50-50 front to back, and Spicer made special drive shafts 2 inches in diameter of 095 wall tubing. A 7-gallon oil tank was mounted to the outside of the car. It was 3 feet tall, 4 feet wide, and 7 inches thick. The body of the car was formed of aluminum. Bobby Unser was handed the keys, and he qualified the all-new car 9th, and then crashed it in practice. The car was immediately repaired, only to be involved in the Dave McDonald, Eddie Sachs fatal disaster almost immediately at the start of the race. Unser was listed as the 32nd finisher. Jim McElrath, upon the restart of the race, and the other Novi had an engine that he was unable to warm up with a set of hotter plugs that the team raced on. They would use the hotter plugs to get the engine up to temperature and then swap the race plugs in. Unable to do that, the plugs fouled, the car ran like garbage, and he quit on lap 77. The Ferguson Novi is a largely ignored piece of the 1964 Indy 500, and for some large reasons. You had the unfortunate fatal accident to start the race that made headlines across America. You had the fact that the rear-engine cars were finally, once again, pressing the roadsters for victory, A.J. Foyt winning in dramatic fashion, and the list goes on and on. Had this car debuted even a year before, it would have been heralded as a mechanical marvel of its time and a technical triumph. Now, by this time in history, Andy Granatelli was claiming that the engines were now making 837 horsepower on the dyno with a 2-stage supercharger shoving 54 pounds of boost into the engine. Undaunted, Andy Granatelli forged ahead. For 1965, he not only had the Ferguson four-wheel drive car, but a new Granatelli four-wheel drive chassis. Some say it's a direct ripoff of the Ferguson. Some say it's a Ferguson with some tweaks. They called it a Granatelli. I'm calling it a Granatelli. Now, there would be 3 Novis vying for glory in 1965, or not. The Granatelli chassis car was wrecked in practice. Jim Hurtubise blew the clutch out of the 1962 rear-wheel drive car on the first lap of the race. Now, Bobby Unser qualified the Ferguson in 8th and went out with an oil leak on lap 69. Once again, nothing but heartbreak and embarrassment after all the work, investment, and time. In 1966, Granatelli managed to become the primary sponsor of the Team Lotus entries that were previously backed by Ford in a primary fashion, and in doing so, he greatly pared back his Novi effort. He only brought one car. It was the reworked four-wheel drive Granatelli chassis, and he had young Greg Weld in the seat. In qualifying, Weld wrecked the car, and that would be the last true effort for a Novi-powered anything at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. All the hope and anticipation that began in 1941 ended in a pile of busted parts in 1966. Now knowing the history of the engine, it kind of seems like a fitting end. So as we look at this whole exhaustive timeline, the entirely kind of bummer of a story, what's the bottom line here? Where did it all go wrong, and why, and how? For starters, we can't blame the engine. In all honesty, the Novi stands as a crowning achievement of its age and the brilliant engineers and designers behind it. The power output was completely insane from the first day to the last. Nothing on the track could touch it for 20-some years. There were maybe 10 of these engines ever made, maybe a couple less, but certainly no more, and many of them live on in restored cars in museum displays today. They still transcend time and era. These things are still amazing to look at, amazing to consider, and kind of revel in. But why did it all go so bad? Now, the answer lies in a couple of places. For starters, the Novi was a one-race engine. Sure, it ran at Bonneville and Monza, but it was designed for the Indy 500. It never saw competition anywhere else. Now, this was a massive disadvantage to the Offie engines of the day that raced on a weekly basis around the country in a variety of forms and formats. The Novi had virtually no development time, and it was all done in competition with basically a year between testing and new ideas getting results. Secondly, the engine was always massively better than the chassis and tires it was powering. Clearly, that's the most major issue. The incredible fact that this thing was used in front-wheel drive cars until 1956 is just stupefying when you think about it. The wrecks, the deaths, and the carnage wrought by this decision was another hindrance. The best drivers didn't want to place themselves in an overtly deadly situation in an era when basically every car was trying to take you out. The 1950s front-wheel drive Novi specials were next-level dangerous, and top-level talent wasn't beating down the door to try to race it. Also, this engine lived in only a handful of chassis over the course of time. Now, if we go back to our Indy-only point, it gave little to no true development and refinement time for the teams, and this goes from Welch all the way to the end of the Granatelli effort. It was always a rush, always kind of a guess. And never did anyone who raced this engine have as much information in the form of laps and races that their Offie-powered competition had. Finally, these were never sold to anyone. Had the Novi been an actual commercial piece that many people could have bought and tuned on, the level of knowledge to making them run right would have been vast. Instead, these were private engines run by a private team and produced in a volume that may be single digits and barely double digits, so there was no real sharing of data, nothing much more to learn, especially when they were making 850 horsepower in an era when that was total fantasy land. In short, the Novi didn't win because it was a bad engine. It never won because it never had a fair shot to do it in the way it was used by various teams, chassis builders, and owners. That said, this thing is a mythically cool beast. It was the guttural screaming monster poised to knock the little Offie right off its perch. It was the perennially muscle-bound underdog, surrounded on all sides by the ubiquitous Offenhauser four-banger. Ultimately, the Novi V8 scared the pants off them a few times, but was never capable of getting the job done. Some say that the Novi is the most beloved race engine in American history, and it may well be. We can fondly remember its audacious nature, its dangerous power levels, and the inspiration it brought to millions who watched it in person, pined for it to win on TV, and dreamed about it in their beds at night, carrying them to Indy 500 glory in front of 300,000 screaming fans. That's the story of the Novi V8. All of it. Or at least as much of it as I can know and pass along to you. I'm Brian Loans. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more racing, engine, mechanical, and sometimes mind-bending history. See you next time.